So you'd have heard that. So a very warm welcome to today's People and Culture Essentials webinar from the TCM Group. My name is David Little. I'm the founder and the chief executive of the TCM Group and a very passionate advocate of mediation. In fact, I've often said, if you cut me in half, which I please don't, but if you cut me in half, you'll find mediation runs right through me. I love it. I enjoy it. I'm passionate about it. And it's all I've really ever done as a career. So it's great to be talking about mediation and the practice of mediation. A lot of my conversations that I have with organizations and human resources and managers and leaders is about developing cultures which are mediation friendly, about integrating compassion, dialogue, principled negotiation, win-win outcomes into the culture of the organization. And sometimes that takes me away from the practice of being a mediator, but like those of you who are on this call who are mediators will know, we can't stay away from the practice of mediation long. So it's really good to be here talking about mediation and talking with so many of you who are on here who I know will also hopefully share that passion for mediation, or indeed are curious about what mediation can do and how it can work. So a very warm welcome to all of you to today's webinar. So what are we going to cover today? Well, I mean, mediation is a fantastic process. It works in so many cases. It can unlock the potential for the individuals in the dispute. It can unlock the potential for their working relationship. In fact, I would argue that the transformation that happens within a mediation is so powerful that the relationship can be better after the parties have been through a mediation process. Greater understanding, greater insight, greater recognition of ourselves and of each other, potentially greater synergy, and that, I think, then lends itself to increased performance and productivity within that relationship. However, that cannot happen. It will not happen if the parties will not get into the room. And I'm sure many of you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the chat function of the challenges you face, but I've certainly been there, where for whatever reason, and there are a lot of reasons, the parties do not want to engage with each other in a mediation process. And as much as we believe it's the right way forward and can really support the two parties, they appear to be stuck, struggling, and in, I find it particularly difficult. Susan, it is the hardest part of the process. It is the hardest part of the process by far. And of course, the beauty of mediation, Susan, and others, is once the parties have secured the commitment to mediation, they know what they're buying into. We're going to help them to understand it. Actually, the rest of the process is a little bit more straightforward because, of course, the parties do all the work. The mediation process is their process. We are there to support them through the process to help them to achieve an outcome based on their underlying needs, goals, hopes, and motivations. So they're doing all the hard work. In actual fact, the hardest part of the process often is securing the commitment. So we're going to look at how to secure commitment to mediation for the parties in a dispute, when they are in a dispute and they're loaded with cortisol, they're fearful, they're anxious, they're worried. How do we help the parties move from, I'll never sit in the room with that person for whatever reason, to actually being willing to give it a go? That, I think, that key question can help us to unlock the potential for mediation. But the mediation doesn't operate in a vacuum. We know that. It's part of an organisational process. So let's look at the role of staff side and other key stakeholders in terms of helping them to secure a commitment to mediation. We'll be looking at the before, the during, and the after. And I often think the after is the bit we sometimes don't focus on. So we're looking at the before, the during, and the after in terms of securing a commitment. We're going to look at using mediation in complex cases. Increasingly, we're seeing mediation being used in complex cases. In fact, I would say that the ferocity of conflict that we're getting through our doors at the moment is stuff that I've probably never seen before. The complexity, the challenge of managers and HR who are really struggling. I've never seen some of the stuff that's coming to us at the moment. It's very unique and very unusual. And we are dealing with some very stressed, distressed, and anxious people, and the emotions are much greater, it feels, at the moment. It's quite interesting. So how can mediation operate in an environment where we're looking at tackling issues around more complex cases? And I'm talking about bullying, harassment, discrimination, amongst others. We'll look at how to build a commitment to developing an internal mediation program. Again, as external mediators, we kind of parachute in and do our thing, but the skills and competencies often exist within organisations, and they're not valued necessarily, not recognised. I think it's more about they're not recognised, they're not understood. How can we unlock the sort of the inner diplomat within our managers and leaders so mediation becomes a norm within our organisations? How can you secure a commitment to mediation from your board and senior managers? Of course, you'll know the answer to that already: evidence, evidence, and more evidence. But there's an absolute lack of that in the mediation space at the moment, which is something of a frustration. So we'll get to that. And ultimately from your HR and unions to a wider mediation program. And I'll also set out for you the fair mediation model, which I know a number of you will be familiar with or have used, but others may not be. So I'm just going to run through what mediation is. So again, anything that you want to ask me, any questions that you've got, please feel free to pop them into the chat box. I'll keep an eye on it, and I'll try and respond to anything that you ask. 45 minutes, so we're due to finish at 1:15. I'll try to stick to that. It's been recorded, as you heard. I'll be putting the recording and the slide deck onto the website that accompanies the PACE webinars. For those of you who've got the link, you'll know that there's a lot of resource on there, but I will send the link out to everyone, so you've got the slide deck, you've got the video and other bits and pieces to boot. I've not set up a poll for this webinar today, but I have got the chat function, so we'll try and make it interactive in that way. Opportunities and questions obviously throughout, and if you did want to have a conversation with me after this session about making mediation a mainstream function within your organisation, feel free to contact me. Very happy to do that. And resolution policies, I've got a really lovely new version of the resolution policy, Catherine, so we must have a conversation about that. Let's talk about it, because we've just designed one for a large ambulance service where we're using resolution to replace discipline and grievance. But I'm happy to share that, and I guess others may as well. A bit about the TCM group. We've been around now, we're into our 20th year, which I can't believe. Prior to that, I ran a mediation charity in the East Midlands. So I'm a restorative justice practitioner, a mediator. I work in and have worked in complex cases, including serious criminality, gangs and neighbour disputes, and them for 20 years working in organisations. So, and we've won awards for this stuff. We're a mediation provider of the year back in 2018, and done lots of exciting stuff to boot. And we work with a number of organisations to integrate mediation programs within those organisations. So let's look at mediation and think about what mediation is. I know a number of you are mediators and are doing this every day. So for those of you, hopefully this will be a recap, but to others, it can be a bit of a mysterious process. What exactly is it? Well, it's a non-adversarial way of resolving difficult situations. Now, it's a simple sentence, isn't it? It's a non-adversarial way of resolving difficult situations. Our society and our organisations are so focused on retributive justice, retribution, a winner, a loser, a right or a wrong, or black or white, that sentence actually challenges fundamentally the notions of justice that run through society and run through our organisations. So it's about restoring relationships and building relationships, and using that term reset. I'm really interested in this term reset, resetting relationships in the new normal, a new normal for the parties to move away from confrontation, dogma and blame towards language of cooperation, collaboration and compassion and dialogue. Mediation is a mindset. So when we're in conflict, do we go for a Costa coffee and a muffin? Or do I reach for the grievance procedure and start hitting you over the head with it? It's a mindset. It's a framework which we'll be talking about today, the process of mediation. There is a process, there's a beginning, a middle and an end. And some people call it informal. I don't call it informal, I call it thorough, I call it challenging, I call it a very real form of justice that we help to deliver for the parties with a beginning, a middle and an end. It's well thought through, it's robust and structured. But it's also a set of skills that we can all use at the dining room table, with our neighbours, with our friends, with our family, the skills of reframing, of listening, of being curious, of nudging rather than pushing, showing rather than telling, engaging rather than pushing people away, and empathy, self-awareness and insight. So the mediator is a neutral third party. We're not there to blame or judge or take sides or tut. We don't tut mediation. I don't think tutting sits in our vocabulary. We don't point a finger and tell people how naughty they've been. We listen. We act impartially. We're aware of our own biases. We're not perfect, but we work and strive towards impartiality. So the parties know we're not there to blame or to infer any judgment or evaluation. We help then the parties to have an open and honest discussion, to identify a mutually acceptable outcome. Wow, what does this say to us? Are we saying here that you, the human being in conflict with another human being, has the capacity to resolve your own problems? Isn't that absolutely fantastic? If we can create the conditions, you can solve your own problems. And again, it's a very different approach than we see in our parent-child dynamic that we see within our organisations. We treat people like adults and encourage an adult-to-adult dialogue on the basis that when they have agency, they have capacity. When they have capacity, they can resolve their own problems. Our job is to create the conditions for that to happen. So it's about collaborating. And the mediation agreement is from the parties, not from us, the mediator, or another person with authority. And this can throw up some real surprises for both the parties and for the organisation. And this is what makes mediation so fabulously interesting and so exciting and so exhilarating, because the parties can come up with their own solutions, and they are imaginative and creative and innovative. And often when you're looking at grievances and complaints, imaginative, creative and innovative, other than the things they want to do to each other, aren't necessarily the words you might use to describe this stuff. So we're not there to judge or tell. We don't tell people what to do. And the really important guidelines here: mediation is voluntary and it's confidential. I'll start with the last one. Confidential. What's said in mediation stays in mediation. That is a non-questionable, non-arguable, absolute fact, that what you say in mediation will go no further. It's a voluntary process as well. You need to enter into the process of your own volition. Now, I would argue, and we'll be doing so today, that there's a lot more we can do to nudge people into the mediation process. And I don't personally think that I wouldn't mediate with him, he's a bully, I wouldn't mediate with her, she'll never change, are really very good reasons why we wouldn't get into a mediation room. And we need to respect those, but also challenge them sympathetically. But ultimately, the decision to enter into the process is with the parties. But because it's confidential, they can say things that they need to say and get things said and have the conversation that they need to have. So our model of mediating is called FAIR, which is quite handy because it's a fair process. And it also stands for facilitate, to make a process easier; appreciate, to understand each other's point of view; also drawing on appreciative inquiry, to focus not just on the bad stuff, there's probably a lot of it, but there's also good stuff, the things that does work in the relationship or did work when they were friends and things broke down. So we draw out the positives as well as the challenges. We then encourage innovation for the parties, innovation around needs, goals and motivations rather than wants and dogma. Innovation and creativity. And ultimately the mediation process helps the party to resolve the situation. And also it builds resolve for the parties, and that resolve that we build in mediation transforms into resilience, relational resilience and personal resilience outside of the mediation process. So the resolve almost transforms into resilience once the mediation process is concluded. And this is a mediation. It's a very simple process. The challenge with mediation is it happens behind closed doors, and that's one of the powers of mediation. But because it does that, it can be mired in a little bit of mystery and confusion. So let's just bust any myths about what goes on. The mediator meets the parties separately in a private meeting. We meet under the FAIR model. We meet the parties twice. We focus on, it's a sort of narrative form, past, what happened in the past, not from who's to blame or who's at fault, but from the past of who drawing out insight, learning, understanding, self-awareness. Where are you now? The present. How are you feeling? How do you think the other person's feeling today? Wow, what a great question. Before we've even brought the parties together, we're building a bridge of empathy and engagement with the two parties. We then break, meet the other person, then we come back and ask the parties about the future. And we're not asking them about the future in weeks and months' time. We're asking the future about, in a few moments, you're going to be meeting with each other. What do you want to say? How do you want to say it? What do you think the other person might say? How will you react? How might they react? It's coaching, conflict coaching that we're doing in that second meeting, preparing them to meet. And in that period of time, of course, we'll be focused on getting them to the room, but constantly through this process, we're building rapport, we're building trust, we're listening, we're engaging, we're challenging assertively, we're reframing, and all the while we're building a commitment to mediation from the parties, both to the mediation process, to the mediator, but also then subsequently to each other. And that's based on trust and psychological safety. So here we have our joint mediation meeting, and the mediator is creating the space where the parties can feel safe, some basic ground rules about listening, being respectful, recognising the confidential nature of the meeting, being open and honest, take a chance. Now, this is the best, this is the opportunity for the best conversation for you that you could have. Take that chance to have the best conversation for you to both have. We let the parties then have a period of uninterrupted speaking time to listen to each other and to share. We ask some questions, again, to secure that commitment about the impact, the needs, the consequences of the situation. Then we open up an exchange between the parties, let them listen and talk to each other. And we almost, this is where, for those of you in media, so you know, we kind of almost sit back, we get the paper out here, and the parties are doing, they are doing the hard work now. And our job now is to hold that space. So we're using different skills. I'm not going to run an entire mediation training session on this, but it's a fantastically powerful process. And the mediator's role is transforming all the time. But at the very beginning, we're hands-on, we're almost leaning forward, we're really engaged in the process. And the parties are less engaged in the process, and it's quite, the locus of control sits with the mediator. But as we secure the commitment from the parties to the process and to each other, we can then slowly slide away, and we become less the focus and they become more the focus. And there's a real transformation that's happening in the room. It's very powerful, and I enjoy watching it and being part of that. But ultimately, it's about empowering the parties. And then at the end of the mediation, I get up and walk out and say, right, yeah, reflect a little bit on what you've learned, what you've seen. I'll go and copy the agreement. And actually, the best mediation I've ever done is in absentia after I've left the room. That's where the real mediation happens, when I've left the room. So in a nutshell, it's voluntary, it's confidential, I've said, it's safe, it's empowering, it's respectful, it's that neutrality that we bring. The mediator is, as we said, impartial, empathetic. They manage that process with control, they build that understanding, and they listen. And there are huge benefits. We're going to come to those benefits because, of course, they're part of helping people to secure a commitment to mediation. There are massive, massive, massive benefits to mediation. And it surprises me, given how powerful it is and how effective it is, how little it is recognised in terms of bringing benefits to people. If there's one benefit, I think, that we should really focus on as mediators, as a mediation community and organisations, is we help people to have a better night's kip. I genuinely believe that's one of the biggest benefits that we bring, is we help people sleep better in their beds at night. The amount of cases I've dealt with where the parties are not sleeping, they're not able to then think rationally through the day, it's impacting their work. And if you're a surgeon in the hospital, this is serious stuff, but it doesn't matter what role you might be playing. And then we actually then are relying on them to be rational and cognitive when they're dealing with each other. So there are numerous benefits. But helping people to sleep better in their beds at night has got to be one of the biggest benefits I think mediation brings for the parties, for the individuals, and for the organisation. So once we can get the parties to the room, and of course the challenge we'll be focusing on in a minute is how do we get you there? Once you're there, actually, the chances of this process being successful are incredibly high, and over 90% of cases are reaching a successful resolution. And before the webinar, I just asked the team at TCM just to share with me the mediations that we've done in the last 2 or 3 months. Obviously, a lot of them being online. I think we've had about 2 out of about 30 cases we've done that hadn't reached a successful outcome. And a successful outcome is defined by the parties reaching an agreement and signing that agreement between themselves that they can go back to work. And for those people who are often thinking about, well, how long does it last? We also design into our agreements a resilience clause, because what we're not doing is designing out conflict. We're designing in conflict. And we're asking the parties, when it breaks down, when things happen, what will you do differently? So we build into those agreements a resilience clause to help the parties to resolve those issues. That's a great question, Claire. Is it an industry success rate? Absolutely. I think if you look at various pieces of publications, I will share a publication from ACAS, a piece of research into a hospital that I work with in Northumbria, and they've done a lot of work to embed mediation. That success rate is the same, both internal mediators and external mediators. Well, of course, the benefit of this is, Claire, if you're not going to subscribe to mediation, don't come into the process. It's not right for you. So as part of me securing a commitment to mediation, I'm going to help you to choose to enter into the mediation process. And if you're not minded towards having a conversation, being challenged, challenging the other person with the support of the mediator, then maybe mediation isn't quite right for you. So success runs through mediation, like Blackpool runs through a rock. Because once you've made that decision, it's a real mindset decision. Don't make it lightly. Please do not make the decision to come into mediation lightly. But once you've made the decision to come into mediation, wow, amazing things are going to happen. And they will happen because your mindset has already shifted towards a language of mediation and resolution. And that is a big mindset shift from the parties, where the mindset is around blame, culpability, retribution, pound of flesh, formal justice. So the very language, the contracting and engagement we do with the parties at the point where they're securing a commitment to mediation, in and of itself defines the nature of the success of mediation. So we're going to look at sort of how to secure a commitment to mediation. And before we do that, let's just think about some of the barriers to this process being effective. Well, I think I'm up to about 1,754 reasons why one person can't sit in a room with another person. And I remember when I was in Leicester mediating with two families at war, and one family, if you know community mediation model, we meet one party one evening and we see the other one the next evening, and then we might see them again, and then we try and bring them together. It's a slightly different than the workplace, which tends to happen in a day. So the two families, one of the families said, actually, we don't want to get into the room with the other family because they will pull a knife on us. And I thought, oh gosh, out of the 1,000 or so reasons I've heard for mediation not being the right route, that's probably the best one I've heard. But it wasn't good enough to stop the mediation process happening. So I approached our local magistrates courts. If you've ever been in a magistrates court, you'll know you have to go through a metal detector before you go in. We had a good relationship with them. They gave us 3 rooms in the back of the magistrates court, and the two families came in, went through a metal detector. There was no concerns about anyone carrying any weapons into the process, and the two of them had an absolutely fantastic conversation and resolved a lot of their underlying issues. So whilst I have heard a lot of really good reasons, and I really respect them, and there's some of them here, I'm yet to hear a good one. And I'm yet to hear a reason why the parties can't get into the room, which isn't based on a perception, a prejudice, underlying fear of loss being a major barrier. Thank you, Susan. I was very pleased with it as well. So yeah, a real barrier, but it's all here. It's all about how we perceive the world and how we see the situation. So, and a lot of it stems from a loss, and those losses might be an actual loss. I've lost something. We can experience that sort of that response to grief. It might be a perceived loss, or one of the biggest barriers to getting people into mediation is a fear of future loss. People are smart. They're really smart. They're playing chess. They're moving 2, 3, 4, 5 steps ahead of you. And they are seeing loss, fear, loss, and loss. And we know loss is going to hurt us. And so on the basis of that, we will protect ourselves from it. And actually, in order to be able to secure a commitment to mediation, first we need to understand what the perceived loss is, what the impact of that would be, and how do we turn the loss into a gain. So we need to reflect and be sensitive to that, and then start asking some questions and trying to get underneath the surface of that and begin to reframe the loss, because the loss is an expression of a potential unmet need. Well, what's the need that's not being met? Let's understand what that need is, and then we can start to focus on how we could ensure that the need is met through dialogue, rather than avoiding it, because as we know, avoiding those difficult conversations, avoiding the other person actually doesn't address our underlying needs, and paradoxically will result in greater loss. And when we are able to have a conversation with people and they know that we're listening to them, and that amygdala response and the cortisol starts to seep away, they start to recognize actually the rational response is to address it and communicate it to the other person. But that's probably at the moment where they're feeling anxious and worried, it feels like the least safe thing to do. So these are all things we've heard. Again, if you've ever come up against any, share them here. So it feels unsafe. It'll be seen as a sign of weakness. I want my day in court. I want my pound of flesh. I don't believe this process will work. It's them. It's not me. I love that it's them. It's not me. I say, well, if it's them, it's not you. Are you suggesting then that you'll sign up to mediation? Absolutely. I'll give it a go, but they'll never sign up. Great. Well, I've now got 50% of the parties to a dispute signed up. I'll take that for now. let me speak to the other party and see how we get on. Because they'll say, well, it's them, not me. Are you suggesting that you'll sign up? I'll sign up to mediation. Well, they won't. And of course, I won't necessarily let it slip that they've already signed up. But I know we've got 100% sign up to the mediation process. And the parties were convinced that wasn't going to be happening. Let's have a look at it, see if you've got any questions. Okay, I'll come to some of these. Yeah. Okay, so thank you, Kath. I think you've answered a couple of questions. Feel free to answer questions in the chat. I'll come back. I'll come to some of those questions. So what I wanted to do is look at the context within which mediation operates. The sort of what I might call the gatekeepers or the key stakeholders to the mediation process, and what role each of these different players can play before, during, and critically after mediation. Because securing a commitment to the mediation process is great. Getting the parties in the room is transformational and incredibly powerful, but it counts for naught if what the parties have agreed in the mediation process cannot be sustained within the context of their working lives as part of what I call the most impactful part of their working life, BAU, business as usual. So we need to concentrate on the BAU, the business as usual, which is the after the mediation process. So before the mediation process commences, we need to look at these key, the key players, what I call the sort of the nobly call them the modern triumvirate of the union's management and HR function. Mediation works best where mediation is a considered part of the organisation's response as part of their employee relations frameworks, is written into their policy documentation, and they have a language of mediation. The parties are being invulnerable. They do not want to be experimented on by some new medication, and they don't want to go into meditation. They don't think it's going to work. Well, it's not medication or meditation, it's mediation. But of course, the parties don't know that. And if the first time they've ever heard the word mediation is at a point where they're emotionally aroused and very anxious, the chances are the first word that will come out of their mouth is no. And actually, when you say no as a party to an HR business partner or to a manager, it's very hard to turn the no into a maybe. Yes, we'll focus on how to do that, but it's difficult. So organisationally, unions, HR managers working together to have a wider conversation in their organisation about the use of mediation and other ADR, alternative dispute resolution processes, creates a context within the organisation where mediation becomes normalised and is not a surprise. So then when we speak to the individuals involved, they understand what mediation is. It also gives us an opportunity to have that really important question with the unions. Am I allowed to sit in the room with my member? Unfortunately not, but let me explain to you all the amazing things you can do as a union colleague to support your members before, during, and after the mediation process. I'd much sooner have that conversation with a really active staff side representative who's doing an amazing job of supporting their member, but probably wouldn't be a useful support in the mediation process. I want to have that conversation with you as early as possible, so it doesn't feel that I'm pushing you away or being defensive or in some respects blocking you out, because you've got a really important job to do, which is to protect your members' interests and hold the organisation to account. And I respect that very deeply, but it's not going to help in the mediation process, because what it can create is an adversarial culture within the mediation process, whereas an individual has the union rep, the manager wants to have the HR business partner. And that's not going to help that's not going to help us. So let's have that conversation as early as we possibly can. We can also recognise the infrastructure that needs to happen around mediation. And in particular, the challenge to HR and managers is when the mediator's done their work, what will you do to support the parties? Because what I find, and thankfully this is changing, is people are treading on eggshells around the parties after the mediation process. Are we allowed to talk about it? We don't know what's happening in the room. Should we know what's happening in the room? And actually no one's talking to the party saying, what can we do to help you? Congratulations on securing an outcome. You are going to experience further challenges. How can you let us know how we can best support you? Almost that sort of servant leadership model, which really kind of plays to this whole approach. So we look to have those conversations about what the organisation can be doing to support and serve the needs of the employees once they've returned back to the workplace. So that's a really important part of the process, demystifying it, having those difficult conversations earlier, writing it into the policy framework, maybe creating, again, go to your internal comms person, create a little intranet page. I know a number of you have done this in your own organisations, sharing some some anonymized or composite case studies to show how mediation works. So that's before. During the process, and I'll come to this in more detail in terms of securing the commitment to the parties, the unions, managers and HR, they remove themselves from the process. They're allowing us now to focus on the employees. So I want to focus in my next set of slides about how do we secure the commitment to mediation from the employees. And then when they come back, this triangle moves back into shape again, and it's about building that support and infrastructure around the parties. Now, I'm not going to say too much on the policy frameworks, but if you have the GBH policy framework in your organisation, and you're doing GBH on your staff right now, grievance, bullying and harassment policy framework, expect this lovely pristine triangle to break up and fall apart, because GBH drives a culture and an attitude of confrontation and adversarial processes. So maybe part of the aftermath of the conflict resolution is for the organisation to learn lessons and to reflect on how the organisation can change. And this is the real power for mediation. And I feel very strongly as a mediator that it's the bit of mediation that's lost are the lessons learned. And how can the organisation respond? And for those of you who are from an HR background, I wish, and I know the parties wish this as well, and I hope you will do it, is speak to the people after a mediation process. You're not going to know what's happening in the mediation, nor should you. But ask the individuals, what learning and insights have they taken from the conflict or the experience of mediation that can help your organisation to grow and flourish? And send the message to the employees who've been through the mediation process that you value their experience and you see their experience as a positive one that can drive and create learning and insight for your organisation. Those employees are going to fall backwards as you ask them those questions. But one thing is for sure, when they receive their next engagement survey or their staff satisfaction survey, I bet you are getting 5s and 10s for that level of engagement, because you are genuinely engaging with them at a time of crisis and conflict. And that's what employees are telling me is key to them to feeling engaged and valued in part of their organisation. So this isn't going to happen. Yeah, mediation. No one is going to be screaming from the rooftops. Let's be honest, it's like going to the dentist. Unless you have a particular penchant for someone sticking sharp metal instruments into your mouth, you're probably not going to want to go to mediation. So I'm afraid to report, when you're speaking to the employee, they're not going to do this. They're probably going to do this, the Golden Grunt. There's some great sound effects, by the way, in mediation. I love the sound effects. There's this other sound of, mediators, you might go, I didn't realise when I called you a waste of space. You might feel a bit embarrassed. I didn't realise that when I pointed at you in a team meeting and said something negative, that you might feel a little bit insecure in front of your colleagues. So that's another great, is a great sound effect. We love that sound effect in mediation. But this is the early sound effect. This is the securing a commitment to mediation. I'll give it a go. And that's as good as it gets. That's all we need. We don't need the parties to be signing up to it and being exhilarated and really up for it. They're not going to be that. Let's be realistic. So what we need to do is, how do we get to the Golden Grunt? And this is important for us as mediators, for those who are in HR or management roles where you are a gatekeeper to the process. First thing is stop talking, he says, having spoken at you for the last half an hour. So apologies, not modelling the best practice, but it's difficult to listen. Well, obviously everyone else is listening, but I'd like to be able to model some of these practices. But listen, please. You know, there's no disrespect to a manager. A manager said to me, David, what practical tips can you give me? I think it was the end of a training course, so I was kind of feeling that little bit of exhilaration about to. I think I just said, shut up. And actually they took it really well, thankfully. I'm glad I did. But stop talking at your people. Listen to them and listen to understand and listen to help them describe the meaning and the impact upon themselves. Let them reflect on that. You know, again, if you're familiar with Marshall Rosenberg and nonviolent communication, massive advocate, and it runs through this. But really help them to talk about what they've seen happening and the impact of the behaviour on them, their feelings. Acknowledge, name, and very sensitively challenge perceptions, biases, and prejudices. The reason they're not wanting to go into the process is, as I've said before, based on perceptions, biases, and prejudices. Listen to them, respect them. And don't wave a finger and go, oh my goodness, mate, that's terrible. How could you think that about the other person? They form that view, but now you can very subtly and challenge back those prejudices, because they are just that. And by naming them, oftentimes when people hear, say, actually, no, you're right, I did that, no. So yeah, I probably don't actually think that particular way. And then these questions are really important, is what do you need? And there are three sets of needs we have when we're thinking about going into mediation. There are psychological needs. Our safety is the first one, to feel heard, to feel valued and respected in that space. Those psychological needs are really powerful. And when those psychological needs aren't being met, or we perceive they won't be met, we have a fear of loss. And the fear of loss drives the barriers coming up, and also that sense, that amygdala response and the cortisol response, which is often comes about because of a fear of defense. So listen to the psychological needs. The parties will also have needs about process, the process being fair, robust, rigorous, objective, having an end point. Now, the parties often don't know what mediation is, but they know a litigation-based process because they've grown up with it through their lives. So we need to understand what their procedural needs are. And oftentimes their procedural needs are to be heard, to be understood. But when we look at other processes, formal processes, you don't get the chance to be heard in the process. So actually, when they're talking about their procedural needs, well, it's really curious. They design mediation. I said, you know something, that's really curious. You've got those needs. I'm sure there's a process out there. What's it called? Oh, mediation. It's doing exactly what you've said you need to happen. Would you have those needs met through another process? And the substantive needs are the needs they have in relation to the relationship with the other. So when I'm doing my preliminary phone call to the parties, I'm asking them these questions. And as soon as they start to tell me about their substantive needs, i.e., she said this, he sent me this email, she's never done that, I said to them, do you know something, it would be really helpful for us to meet with each other, for me to hear and understand what's going on for you in terms of your relationship. Can we organise for me to be able to get together and meet with you face to face, or indeed in modern times over a Zoom call, because that's the best chance for me to hear this. And by listening to them and reflecting back and understanding their psychological and procedural needs, it builds rapport and trust. And so they say, actually, yeah, no, that would be helpful, David. And before they know it, and before you know it, they are now subscribing to the notion of entering into a mediation process. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. And ultimately, what we're trying to get to, as I've mentioned earlier, is that golden grunt is, okay, I'll tell you what, I'm going to give it a go. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to give it a go. You should bottle it, put it up as the biggest thing. It's the biggest transformation in their minds and in their, probably, that they've had. Every single waking minute and sleeping minute has been spent trying to beat the other person or prevent harm. And now they've just said, okay, I'll give it a go. And again, 30 years in the job, it never ceases to amaze me just how courageous and powerful that statement is when the parties turn around and said, I'll give it a go. They've now given themselves the best possible chance to get in a room and find some way forward. And I celebrate that and salute it and recognise it for what it is. It's a transformation. And as I said earlier, as soon as they've done that and they're willing to do that, the rest of the process is not straightforward. It'd be undermining the process. It's not straightforward, but it's a lot easier. So what we do, and so these are some of the things that have worked for me. Reframing. So reframing is about moving it from, she'll never listen. She'll never listen. What's the point? We've had mediation so many times by the manager or by a friend or by a colleague. It's not really mediation that we know it, but she never listens. So one response will be, okay, well, have you got any evidence to support her never listening to you? Or have you made a diary note? Or could you give me any examples of that, which we might ask? But what I might say is, what I hear you need, I think, and let me just check this out, is you need to really be heard by her. And your concern at the moment is she's not hearing what you want to say. What do you want to say to her? What is it that you want to hear? And how would she show to you that she's really listening to what you're saying? Now let's work through some examples where you've really clarified for her in the way you just have for me, where you've expressed that to her. Do you know something, David? We've probably never had that conversation. It's always been bitter. It's always been difficult. He's a bully. How can I sit in a room with him? He abuses power. I'll tell you what he'll do. He'll put his best face on for you, David, and he'll fool you. And I'm sure you won't be easily fooled, but he'll fool you, and he's going to make you think he's the best thing since sliced bread, because that's all he ever does. But when people aren't watching, he's vicious and nasty and unpleasant. He's a bully. How can you expect me to sit in a room with him? Wow. Okay. So thank you for sharing that. So what I might reflect back and listen and engage a little bit more about the impact there. But what I'm thinking, I'm hearing you say, I think, is you need there to be respect from him. I guess similarly for you, Tim, there needs to be more respect in that relationship. It needs to be more open and transparent. There are behaviours that are happening and he's behaving differently as you're describing it at different times. You need to be able to have some consistency of that behaviour. Needs to be more appreciative and understanding of you. How can we now move forward? How can you begin to move forward to have those needs met, where there's greater respect, understanding, and consistency of behaviour, rather than focusing purely on he's a bully? Because if all we do is we focus on he's a bully, traditionally we'd focus on the evidence, gaining evidence, prove the case, disprove the case, and as we know, in many organisations, they really do struggle to prove the case in relation to he's the bully. Actually, my needs for being respected, understood, and for there to be consistency give me a much greater opportunity to be able to engage in a dialogue with him about what's really important to me, and also to listen to what's really important to you. And again, we'll talk more about it because we're going to focus on dealing with these complex cases. What does a fair outcome look like? Not what do you want, because what I want is often my day in court, or for the person to be hung, drawn and quartered. But what does a fair outcome look like? What do you think a fair outcome looks like to the other person? And actually, when we start to talk about a fair outcome, what we start to hear is that the parties have a much clearer sense of what fairness is, and they will start to tell you what a fair outcome looks like, which is often very different to what they originally began in terms of the more dogmatic view they might have taken. What is your BATNA, WATNA, MALATNA? Again, for those of you who are mediators and trained in mediation, you would have perhaps come across this. For those of you who are not, you might be guessing what is a BATNA, WATNA and a MALATNA. Well, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, if you walk away from the mediation process right now, what's the best alternative that could think? What's the best case scenario? You've probably guessed WATNA already. What's the WATNA, the worst alternative? What's the worst case scenario? And what's the MALATNA, the most likely case scenario? And what those three questions do when we're at the very early stage of understanding their needs and goals is it helps us to contextualize the situation. It also helps us to understand the consequences of walking away or not walking away or engaging. And then we can start to ask the parties, well, do you want those consequences? And what are the consequences? And we're often fearful in our organisations of talking about consequences because our policy frameworks are so based on formal sort of process to talk about consequences is seen as threatening. But actually having a good quality adult-to-adult conversation about the consequences of an action or an inaction is a really important part of having an adult conversation with somebody. So if we can explore what the best alternative is, the worst alternative, the most likely alternative is, then we can start to focus on what the consequences of each of those choices are. And then, by the way, do not make your decision now, please. It's a big decision for you. Go and speak to your partner, your friends, your family, your union colleagues. Do not do it now based on this conversation, because I don't want you to feel that I've sold it to you or oversold it to you. I want you to feel this is the right decision for you. But one thing, I can tell you two things for certain. One is I will completely respect whatever decision you make. And the second is if you decide not to come through the mediation process, the door to mediation will stay firmly open to you forever. You will not be preventing yourself from opening that door tomorrow or the next day or the next day. When it's ready for you, it will be there for you. So don't feel you're being pressured. Don't feel you have to do it now. And take your time to do it. And by giving them real space and real time to reflect without feeling pressurized, it's amazing how many parties will come back the next day and be honest with you and either say, do you know something? Yeah, it's Golden Grunt, I'm going to give it a go. Or I've really reflected and I don't think it's the right route for me now. That's fine. You're an adult. You're an adult. This is your decision. But that door remains firmly open. And it's amazing. You know, you get that feeling of, oh, that's a shame. I think it could have benefited them. You get a phone call a week later. Something's happened. They met each other in a car park and started snarling at each other. And they realised, you know something, I perhaps need to do something differently. Can we just revisit? Just let me ask you a couple of questions about something you said. Let's revisit that. And suddenly you're having another conversation. Goodness me, we've got some great questions. Please, clearly I'm not going to get to all the questions. It's 13:15 now, so we're coming to the end of the session. But if you've got questions, I know Catherine, you're and there's some good debate here. I will try and get to this if I can, but I'm having a little read through. But I can see there's some really good conversations and discussions going on. So feel free in the chat area to carry on those conversations. And those of you who are mediators, maybe feel free to respond to those people who are asking questions about mediation. Again, feel free to use the chat area to continue that debate. So again, securing a commitment to mediation, just want to put this out there. Mediation isn't just for the he said, she said type situation. Mediation is there for bullying, harassment, discrimination, and complex cases. I think mediators and mediation has not been aspirational enough at all, and that we had self-limiting beliefs as mediators that we can't deal with mediation in race cases, or sexual harassment should not be offered to mediation. I genuinely do not believe that is the case at all. Be led by the parties. If the parties feel that some form of a restorative intervention would be beneficial in their case, let's be led by the parties. Now, if the organisation wants to come down on a particular behaviour, then that's the organisation's choice, and mediation might not be appropriate. But I would be saying to organisations, be more nuanced and sophisticated and person-centred in your remedy. Integrate restorative justice and mediation into your range of responses. Be led by the individuals. You can still take a very clear stance as an organisation about inappropriate behaviour, and clearly in the current context of Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd and all of the issues that we're facing, this is a very sensitive issue. But I'm going to say very clearly that I believe, hand on heart, and have real evidence and seen it, where mediation can and does work in cases where there has been abuse of power, where there has been a significant harmful impact by one person's behaviour upon another. And I genuinely believe mediation should sit within your range of reasonable responses as an organisation and should be considered in each case. That's not to say it would happen in each case, but if we don't offer the parties the opportunity to have these needs met, justice, fairness, to be control, to be heard and understood, to understand the motivation and intention of the other, to receive an apology, some form of reparation, to protect the relationship and to draw insight, change and learning from a situation. If we don't present the parties with an opportunity to do this in complex cases, all you're doing is you're just retaining a great big hammer. And if the only tool you want to have in your toolbox is a hammer, then that, I suppose, is fine. But actually, I think organisations should be more sophisticated and nuanced in their range of responses. I certainly call on HR directors and union officials and senior leaders to take a step and look at this and have a really big conversation in your organisation, a really big conversation about how you want to resolve some of the underlying issues that we know exist in relation to discrimination and harassment, bullying, abuse of power, structural and institutional racism and discrimination in all its forms. And I would argue passionately that embedded in that response should be a focus on restorative justice and mediation within that response. But we can't do that unless we have this conversation with all of these people. And this is the kind of conversation that helps us to integrate and secure a commitment to mediation in our organisation. So I'm going to start wrapping up now, folks. So I can see it's my clock is ticking ahead of me. I've been talking about mediation. There's two things mediators love. We know this. Mediators love mediating. But when they get an opportunity to talk at a screen about mediation, we love talking about mediation as well. So it's our favourite topic to talk about. So I could go on for hours, but we haven't got hours. So I need to start wrapping up. But big conversations. How can mediation and restorative justice support you to achieve your objectives as a person-centred, values-based, compassionate, collaborative workplace? If you're not those things, then what sort of workplace are you? What sort of workplace do you want to be? If you're not values-led, what are you? If you're not aligning your leaders' values to the behaviour to the values, what kind of behaviours are you expecting? If you have a rigid and divisive policy framework, which damages relationships, what kind of organisation do you want to be? So the next, this slide is really setting out some of the things organisations might wish to do, just in terms of addressing and challenging and changing some of the ways that they are introducing mediation. And so I've got some basic frameworks. So developing a business case, developing the evidence, I've got a program I'm running with a number of key academics and helping to develop an evidence base for developing mediation frameworks. Building a resolution framework and a resolution hub, usually called resolution unit, now a resolution hub, which brings key stakeholders together to drive a culture of resolution. Support the development of in-house mediators, communicate the scheme. The reason I've got Brian Clough, some of you may know, I grew up in Nottingham, up in the East Midlands, when Brian Clough was the manager of Nottingham Forest, and he was a real character. I think he actually said this when he was at Derby County. But for those of you who think embarking on a journey of integrating mediation will be it's going to take time. Rome wasn't built in a day, as Brian Clough rightly said. If he was on the job, he would have had it built in a day, and then probably had some time left over as well. So it's a reminder, it's going to take time. But actually integrating mediation could probably be one of the biggest and most impactful things that your organisation does to help resolve underlying employee concerns. I would say whenever I go into organisations and review their bullying, harassment, discrimination and grievance cases, in most organisations, if we extract contractual matters, pay conditions, terms and conditions and holiday, over 75% of all grievances, bullying, harassment and discrimination cases could be resolved through mediation. 75%. So immediately, and that's about securing this level of commitment to the process. If we have the infrastructure, the commitment and the buy-in, 75% of all of your reported bullying, harassment, discrimination and grievance cases could, and I would argue should, be resolved through mediation. Now, if you overlay that 75% over the cost of the number of cases that you're dealing with, you will be talking hundreds, if not in some cases, millions of pounds. And one of the things I've not been able to do today is play a video from Lloyds Bank, who we've been working closely with, but there are lots of case studies on our website and examples from organisations. And most of those organisations operate at somewhere between 25 and 30% of cases being resolved, because it's still often new. But as soon as they move into those higher levels, even at 30%, you've only got to have one case that doesn't go to the tribunal, and you could be saving tens, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds. Here's some further reading if you're interested in finding out more about mediation. I've just taken, there's some great books out there on Amazon. If you put workplace mediation or mediation into Amazon, you're gonna get some great books, but these are the ones that have inspired me. One of which I wrote, so I suppose I should declare an interest. So Managing Conflict is my text, and that does cover a lot off in mediation. The Mediator's Handbook, I mean, I remember this when I was running Leicestershire Mediation Service, we used it. So it's a great text, well worth reading. Mediating Dangerously, Ken Cloke, the guru of all things mediation. So that had to be in there. And it's a fantastic book and really powerful. And getting to, yes, Principled Negotiation, Fisher and Urai's text, really, again, focuses on how to get the parties beyond their positions into their interests and needs. And it's in that space. So there's 4 texts for you. There's a case study here if you're interested. It's on the delegate zone you'll have, but it's still the most forensic analysis of the use of mediation in an organisational setting, published by ACAS, of work that myself and my team did at Northumbria Healthcare Trust. We desperately need more research. Again, I call out to all academics in the UK who are interested in supporting organisations in the new normal to start to help us as practitioners to start to gather evidence of the impact of mediation alternative dispute resolution, because there is a dearth of evidence there, and it's a real shame that I think it's holding mediation back. So if anyone is on the universities or an academic and wants to have a conversation with me, please do, because we are desperate for your help. So we run these webinars every couple of weeks. The next one is on leading through crisis with Claire Gearon, our head of programs and managing director. They come every 2 weeks. They're great. We get some brilliant feedback. So I hope that you can come to the next one. Sorry about the time, but as I said, there's a lot. I knew there was a lot to cram in. If you're interested in looking at mediation, please let me know. Happy to have a consultation on video, and hopefully over a cup of coffee one day. I do love a good cup of coffee. So hopefully we can get to that fairly soon as well. I mentioned the delegate zone, and then we run loads of training. So again, you're welcome to find out more about that on our website. And finally, please do let us know what you think. Your feedback matters. We're out there, banging the drum for mediation, but as we all know, it's tough out there for small businesses. So the more reviews that we get and people talking about what we're doing, then great. So if you did have a moment to go on to Trustpilot and just leave a little review, I would be very, very grateful for your feedback. And I'll also send out a little feedback survey, but I thought I'd mention that if you had a moment, I would really value it. That's it. Thank you. It's got 10 minutes over. That's not bad by my standards, actually. So for those of you who know, so apologies, it's 10 minutes over, but